share quickly some slides. So my great pleasure to have today Aida Suárez González from University College London to present to us. And she's really going to talk about practical tips to support activities of daily living on people with dementia-related visual impairment and apraxia. And I'm pretty sure she will unpack all this terminology in a minute, what it all means. So it's fantastic to have her here as a speaker. Just in terms of talk etiquette, as always, so please keep your microphone switched off during the talk. Please keep your video switched off during the talk, so it just makes it easier to focus on the speaker. And then you can ask your questions either by the chat, which is in your meeting control bar on the bottom of the screen. You can just type your question in there anytime during the talk, and we can go through the questions then at the end, or if you want to make any comments or share any experiences you have yourself. If you want to ask your question in person, at the end of the talk, then switch on your video, but keep your microphone off, and then I will ask you to switch on your microphone when to ask your questions. If your question was not answered, or you want more information, or you felt shy to ask your question, then please email us on this email address. Don't worry if you can't note it down now. We put it later in the chat as well at the end of the session, so you can email us. And the talk today is, as always, recorded and will be made available, so you can watch it after that again, or share it with other people who you think it might be relevant to. But now over to Aida. Aida is a clinical neuropsychologist at Queen Square Hospital, which is, I think, the leading dementia institution in the UK, if not one of the leading ones in Europe or the world. So it's my great pleasure to have Aida over here today and talk about this topic, which she's a true expert on. So I'll stop sharing here now, and Aida, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction, Michael. I'm going to share my screen now just to make sure that everybody can see it, everybody can hear me, everything is working fine, yes? Perfect. So let's hide on this. Yes, so thank you very much again for the introduction and for inviting me to give this talk. It is a pleasure to share this space with you and all the people attending the webinar today. And so as you have already mentioned, one part of my research and my clinical practice is focused on applying evidence-based rehabilitation approaches and therapies to people living with dementia. So this topic makes part of my talk today. And another thing that I've investigated in the last couple of years is the impact of COVID on people with dementia in the world. So over the next few minutes, I would like to tell you more about what types of strategies are available to support the daily function in dementia. And I will finish with a summary of our current knowledge and understanding about COVID and dementia. So what we have learned after 2 years of the COVID pandemic. So let's make a start. People with dementia, as you all know, experience a wide range of cognitive and behavioral symptoms. And these symptoms vary according to the phenotype and the stage of the disease. But I won't talk today about all these symptoms. I will focus my talk on a cluster of symptoms that arise from damage in the posterior cortices of the brain here at the back, which are apraxia and visuospatial difficulties. So let me illustrate this. This is the human brain. The areas colored in pink correspond to the parietal lobe, and the areas in blue correspond to the occipital lobe. And together they are regarded as the posterior cortices of the brain because they are located at the back. And each one of these areas support different cognitive functions. So the parietal lobe here at the top is the anatomical structure underlying human praxis. And when this structure is damaged, apraxia surfaces. In dementia in general, we see two very common types of apraxia. One is Lymph Apraxia and the other one is dressing apraxia. Lymph apraxia is the inability to perform movements or gestures with your hands that cannot be attributed to motor deficits. And dressing apraxia, on the other hand, is the inability to get dressed. And it usually arises from the combination of lymph apraxia and a breakdown in spatial abilities. And this is how the clinical presentation of someone with progressive apraxia looks like in clinic. So this is Laura, who is 65. And 3 years ago, Laura started showing progressive difficulties to perform everyday activities with her hands. She will, for instance, struggle to thread the needle when showing. Her handwriting deteriorated. And at present, she cannot open a packet of crisps, or she cannot use cutlery in her left hand, or butter and slice of bread, or tie her shoes. This illustrates a selective affectation of the parietal lobe, but we said that the posterior cortices also include the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe is responsible for processing the visual information coming through the eyes and making sense of this information. So when this part of the brain stops working correctly, visual impairment occurs. And this is an example of the clinical presentation of a person with posterior cortical atrophy, which is a type of dementia characterized by a selective impairment of the visual system. So visual impairment in posterior cortical atrophy is the first and most prominent symptom at disease onset. And this is John, who lives with PCA. John has started having difficulties reading, and he struggles following the lines of text, and he has changed glasses a couple of times lately because he feels his sight is not as good as it used to be. And he also struggles to calculate the distance with other cars with driving, and he has dented his car twice in the last 4 months trying to park. His wife has noticed that he sometimes wears his jumper with the back to front, like having some sort of spatial difficulties already. So with these two examples, we have learned about all these problems that our posterior cortices can give to us when they stop functioning correctly. And now we want to know if this really happened to many people with dementia. So is this very common, or these are just anecdotal experiences? So just to give you a taste of how frequent they are, I'll tell you that really these symptoms are present in most types of dementia. So in particular, apraxia is very prevalent across Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and dementia with Lewy bodies. And you know that Alzheimer's disease is by far the most prevalent of all types of dementia, accounting for around 70% of all dementia cases. And the second more prevalent is dementia with Lewy bodies. And the third most prevalent is frontotemporal dementia. So apraxia is present in all these conditions in variable degrees of severity, but present. And on the other hand, the combination of apraxia and visuospatial impairment is always present in posterior cortical atrophy and frequent in atypical Parkinsonisms, like a progressive supranuclear palsy, for instance. So we know that these posterior cortical symptoms are prevalent. We know that they produce disability and that affect a lot of people. And now, what can we do about it? There is an extended belief that when there is no cure and the disease is progressive, there is little we can do to help people living with these conditions. And I really hope that by the end of this talk, I've convinced all of you that this idea should be banished, because today we count with a wide range of strategies, and we know that patients and families benefit a lot from receiving training and education on how to use these strategies. So let's review together some common compensatory strategies for the three main symptoms that we are discussing today, which are lymph apraxia, dressing apraxia, and visual impairment. And we're going to start with lymph apraxia. So in the case study that I presented earlier, Laura couldn't tie her shoes due to her lymph apraxia, but Laura can use no-tie elastic lace shoes. There is a big and a fashionable market around adaptive clothes that can help people with apraxia, with these difficulties with hand dexterity, to overcome daily barriers. And this is available not only for shoes. People with apraxia also struggle to up buttons and zips, but buttons and zips can be replaced with Velcros and elastics. As in the case of shoes, there is also a growing market of adapted clothes that can support independent dressing. And in the past, to be honest, it used to be very ugly clothing, but nowadays the market has changed, and there are gorgeous pieces of clothing that are adapted for people with hand dexterity issues. And of course, there are all sorts of homemade strategies that are simple and effective. And for instance, what you are seeing here in the last picture is this is a plate clip. They are called plate clips, and they are used by many people with lymph apraxia. The clip is useful to stop the food in the border, so it doesn't matter that you cannot see the border well or that you cannot use the fork well. You can still enjoy your meal without the food annoyingly ending on the tablecloth. And all these are examples of environmental adaptations that we can introduce to live better with lymph apraxia. What happens with dressing apraxia when the deficit is more complex, because it is not only about lymph apraxia, but also about spatial difficulties? So for those of you that are not very familiar with the term, dressing apraxia is the inability to put your clothes on. And the typical person with this difficulty will be unable to get the garment in the right position, or may also struggle to find the right sleeve to put their arm through. So these are the typical signs that you can observe in someone with dressing apraxia. So how can we help in these cases? Well, getting dressed is a complex task and involves many different kinds of praxis and cognitive skills. It is quite a demanding cognitive skill, getting dressed every day in the morning. So I have broken down the act of getting dressed in 4 main steps here. There is a dissociation between these steps, which means that some of them can be impaired and some can be preserved at the same time in the same person. And it is very important when we are implementing strategies to support someone with dressing apraxia that we assist only in the step that is impaired, not the rest, because this will, if we only provide help where help is needed, we are increasing the chances of the person with dementia to participate in the process and become independent in at least in some of the tasks. So, for instance, failing to choose the right clothes is usually due to issues with attention, episodic memory, working memory, and decision making. And maybe the person is able to do all the rest of the steps independently, but fails on this one. So we don't need to provide help on all the steps. If the problem is at this level, we assist only at this level by, for instance, making available only the clothes appropriate for the current season, or laying out in the bed or chair the outfit for the day. The next step in the dressing process, the next step after choosing the clothes, is putting them in the right order. And failing to do so can be as a result of other kind of apraxia that we call ideational apraxia. And it's the inability to perform sequences in the right order, sequences of movements in the right order. And a way around this barrier is, for instance, separating the garments that come first from those that come later, like placing all the underwear here on the side, and the shirts on the other side, and jumpers and trousers on a different place. And once we have everything in the right order, before we can put our clothes on, we need to find the right position in the space. And struggling to understand what goes front and what goes back, or if something is upside down, is usually a symptom of visuospatial breakdown, and it is extremely frequent in people who experience posterior symptoms. But luckily, we know that visual cues can be successfully used by people with visuospatial impairment to correctly orient an article of clothing. So an extended, so this is really quite a common strategy used by many people I see in clinic. People are very creative, and the way they use visual cues, homemade visual cues, is by sewing or sticking tags or labels of striking colors in meaningful locations in the fabric. They usually do it in the back of the neck of the garment. And finally, the last bit in the process of getting dressed is doing up buttons and zips. And we have already discussed the strategies available to overcome difficulties derived from lymph apraxia. So I'm moving on to the next symptom. And the last stop in this brief tour about compensatory strategies for posterior cortical symptoms is how we deal with visual impairment. So we discussed the use of visual aids or cues to assist people in the process of getting dressed. And visual aids are also helpful to navigate and interact with the environment when the person has visual spatial difficulties. Many people with this type of symptoms can perform activities of daily living better when using this type of visual cues. So for instance, this is a microwave, and many people with dementia and brain-related visual impairment find difficult to use the dials or the buttons of the microwave because they cannot see them well or at all. In many people with posterior cortical atrophy, which is this type of dementia characterized by prominent visual impairment, benefit from using colored stickers to find buttons. Not only to find buttons in the microwave, but also to find light switches in the walls and the bottle of shampoo in the shower and even the plate on the table. There is a massive visual advantage of using visual cues to support people with visual difficulties, and this is based on scientific evidence. And there are more strategies that we can use based on evidence. For instance, this illustrates the reading experience of someone with posterior cortical atrophy. People with brain-related visual impairment often have difficulties with reading. They cannot follow the lines of text, they get lost on the page, and they see words cluttering up. And without visual aids, reading may become impossible for people with this type of problem. However, we have useful evidence produced in the last few years showing that reading in these conditions can improve when patients and people affected use visual aids, like for instance, reading rulers, systems that modify the text so the lines can become shorter and the space between lines larger. So we know that these three strategies in particular can be very beneficial for people who have visual difficulties and reading impairment because of these visual difficulties. But now, how can you put all this in practice? Because in a printed book, it is quite difficult to make all these adaptations, right? So my team and I at UCL have packed all these properties into an app, which is tailored to the needs of people with brain-related visual impairment, and it was co-produced with people living with posterior cortical atrophy. This app was tested in a clinical trial, and it proved effective at improving reading in this population. And for those of you who are interested, this is the website of the project, and these 3 buttons at the bottom of the website give you direct access to the mobile app and the browser version. That the browser version, you can operate it from your computer. We are launching next week. It's not available yet, but it will be very soon. So if you visit the website next week, you will be able to access the tool and download the app to your Android or iOS tablet. But I've also brought a demo to give you a taste today of how it works. So I'm gonna click here, please work. Yes, it's working. So this is the landing page. When you start the app, you are taking it straight here. Then you can click through the onboarding section. There is a demographic survey and basic indications of how to use the app, where the settings are located and where the main menu is. You can click get started and are all set. You then have the choice to read news or books. And if you select news, you can currently give access to 3 news outlets. If you go to this Sky News here, is the list of the headlines that are pushed from the broadcaster website. We select one of the articles and are taken to this reading mode. So here is the reading ruler that you can control using the buttons on the side. And you can also change the default settings by going to this space. And for instance, you can change things like the background text visibility, which is grayed out by default, but can also be black or totally removed to meet the needs of the user. And you also have another option here to change the length of the line that has proved to alleviate visual crowding. So it was very important to give the user control over the length of the line. And another example of the things that you can do with the app is to change the line spacing, that by default is set at a standard medium space, but you can increase it slightly more. And you can also you can navigate to the main page, and you can also read books, but not with the browser version. Books are only available in the mobile app. And well, with this demo, I would like to wrap up the part dedicated to strategies and tips to support people with dementia in daily activities. And if you have any questions about anything I've shared, just put it in the chat, or towards the end of the talk, I'm very happy to take live questions. But to conclude my presentation today, I would like to share with you also an overview of what we've learned in the last 2 years about the impact that COVID has had on people with dementia across the world. And I would like to start on April 2020, when this article came out, and within the first 24 hours became one of the top stories in newspapers across the world, receiving really great international coverage. And this article revealed data that was gathered by colleagues here at the London School of Economics. And that data suggested that half of COVID deaths in Europe were happening in care homes. And as you may know, the majority of care home residents are people with dementia. So what this data was really suggesting was that the majority of deaths in care homes were people with dementia. And this alarming news gave a group of us the impetus to document and learn as much as we could about the impact of COVID on people with dementia. So with the support of these guys in the London School of Economics, we put together a team of international researchers, and from April to August 2020, we invested time and effort to gather all the information we could find about what was happening with COVID and people with dementia across the world. And in mid-August, I think the 19th of August was the date of publication, we published all our findings in this cross-country report. So this report contains data that we collected from 9 countries around the world. This is all data from the first wave. And we found first, and of course now we know a lot about what has happened, but back at the time, we didn't have any information. So it was very important to put together all that data. And we were doing it almost on real time because we were collecting the data as the things were happening. And the first thing we found back at the time was that very few countries were publishing official national data about deaths of people with dementia. And the second thing that we found was that the data from England and Wales, Scotland and Italy that did have data, they were providing this data officially. This data suggested that the deaths of people with dementia may account for around a quarter of all COVID deaths nationwide, which is a large proportion and likely connected to the fact that most deaths were happening in care homes. So we decided to extract the percentages of dementia deaths in care homes that were attributable to COVID. And again, what we found was that only 3 countries of the 9 analyzed could provide official data. And you may think, okay, but you are showing now 5 countries. So we'll tell you what happened here. We only accessed reliable data from England, Wales, and Australia. So the data from these 3 countries were official data. And what we did for Spain and Ireland was running estimates. This is, we ran calculations based on the total number of deaths in care homes and the proportion of people with dementia living in care homes, according to the recent epidemiological studies. So the figures for Spain and Ireland were estimates that we built. As you can see, the data suggested that half of the deaths in care homes may correspond to people with dementia, which was really, really sad, right? But beyond the mortality data, we found more things. We found that we became aware that there is a systematic lack of coordination within countries and internationally when it comes to collect data about dementia and about care homes as well. And this makes it very difficult to coordinate any common initiative, and let alone the response to a global emergency as it was the COVID pandemic. And another thing we found were a lot of reports, accounts, and news suggesting a systematic violation of human rights affecting people with dementia. There are many reports of people with cognitive difficulties being denied hospital admission, intensive care, palliative care, and even general care. And we say that this has happened systematically because it was not an isolated fact. It was not an isolated bunch of anecdotes. It has occurred in many places, in many different countries at the same time. And proof of that is that Amnesty International ended up issuing an extensive international reports proving the scale of the human rights violation to people in care homes, and again, most of them with dementia. And as a result of this report, the Lancet dedicated this editorial to this report, to the data that we provided in this report. And I think the title could not be more appropriate. Neglect during a crisis, the stark reality. We were very happy that the Lancet helped us to amplify the message that we tried to convey with the publication of that report. So after that, a few months later, we decided to investigate another related question, which was the impact of the isolation measures on the cognition and mental health of people with dementia. And to do so, we conducted a synthesis of all the quantitative evidence published during the first year of the pandemic. So we gathered all the data from the first 12 months. So we ran our research in February 2021, and we applied the standard methodology of systematic reviews. We followed the guidelines of the Joan Breams Institute. We screened 3 databases. Well, we identified more than 200 initial references and ended up including 15. So only 15 most of these studies came from European countries at the time, but also a few of them from Latin America. And 13 of these studies were on people living in their own homes, and 2 of them were on people living in care homes. And what we found, unsurprisingly, was that the majority of studies reported worsening of neuropsychiatric symptoms associated to the lockdowns, to the isolation in general. And most studies, most of the studies that reported changes in cognition described decline in more than 50% of the sample analyzed. So exacerbation of neuropsychiatric symptoms and cognitive worsening. And we found that only half the studies examined changes in the level of independence for activity of daily living, which also makes sense because during the lockdown, I mean, there was a restriction, there was a limitation in the number of things that you could do. So it wasn't that easy to measure the level of independence, right? But we found that 85% of those studies reported functional decline in people with dementia. And altogether, this data seems in keeping with the notion that lockdowns and isolation had a deleterious effect on people with dementia. And a few months later, so very recently, we conducted a new review, this time led by the group at the University of Liverpool. And this is a preprint of the study, so it is still not out there, but will be soon. And in this time, we included both quantitative and qualitative papers, and we found many more hits when we conducted this search compared with the search in February 2021, and the number of relevant papers went up from the previous 15 to 40 this time, and describing a total sample of more than 9,000 subjects. And the overall findings were pretty similar. So it keeps coming up, this data suggesting that isolation accelerates cognitive decline, that worsens the behavioral symptoms, that influences physical decline. And we also found in this, because this time we also included qualitative papers, we had a broader view and we had more insight into the direct experience of people with dementia and their families during the pandemic. And something that also comes up is the limited access to healthcare and the restricted access as well to social care during the lockdowns and the different waves of COVID, because this study wasn't restricted to the first wave. Something that I would like to highlight to conclude this talk is this piece of opinion that we published in the British Medical Journal, where we advocate for the right of people with dementia to have meaningful human interaction. In this piece, we argue that isolation policies have detrimental effects on people with dementia, and that infection prevention and control policies, when applied properly, enable safe care, and that they should never be used as an excuse to isolate vulnerable people. So I encourage you, those of you who are interested, to visit the Enable Safe Care space to learn more about how we can maintain compassionate, safe human interaction in COVID times. And thank you very much for listening and for your time. I'm open to questions now.
Thank you so much, Aida. That was a fantastic overview, quite contrasting sides, but really, really amazing to get this. So thank you so much. Yes, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We will read them all out, or switch on your video and come online if you want to. So we have already one question by Hugo Pohler. Any idea why Ireland has a lower rate of death of patients with dementia in care homes?
No, we don't know why the variations were so pronounced across countries, really. The pandemic didn't hit, the effect of the pandemic wasn't the same in every country. So there are cross-country variations that we can't explain, or we don't have an explanation yet. But we don't know. We don't know the reason for these variations.
Yeah, I think there's so many questions still, isn't it? And because it's an estimate, it's very difficult as well. If I understood it correctly, for Ireland, wasn't it? Yeah. So then there is a question by Sam Richardson, and thank you for your talk, Aida, very interesting. Will the app be free, or what are the costs? And then he said there's a comment then following, and it looks great. And for people who cannot access technology, we often use a typoscope, so which is a black card with a cutout box from the RNIB shop as a kind of a low-tech option. Sorry, I'm not reading the whole, Sam. I'm not reading the whole comment out, but if you want to have a look at the chat, please do. But just if you wanted to comment on this, so is there cost associated with the app, and what do you think about those low-tech options?
Yeah, so there are no costs at the moment, and we'll try to always keep a free version of the app available in the future, but what we cannot guarantee is that there may be a premium option in the future, and people will have to pay a membership or something like that, just because we need to make it sustainable long term. So we are at the moment exploring all these options to make the app sustainable long term. But at the moment, and definitely for the next few months, it's going to be freely available. And what I think about these low-tech solutions, that they are phenomenal. And actually, what we've done with ReadClear is using all the homemade low-tech solutions and strategies that people were using at home, and we've created like a digital option of all those things. So what you are describing here, this kind of hole, of card with a hole, that is the equivalent to the reading ruler. And ReadClear is completely inspired in these solutions. And I think that it is very important that we still have these options, because not everybody has access to technology. And the technology that we have doesn't work with all type of printed text. Yeah. So yeah, fantastic.
Great, thank you. And then Ravi Kare asks, thanks, Aida. Where can we access information about more practical aids that you suggested? Thanks.
That's a very good question. We should create an educational platform or something like that, right? So I give talks about practical aids and strategies for people with dementia, and they are in YouTube. So that is a way, I guess, to access more information. And I'm not aware of any hub, any website that gathers all this information together. But for instance, so the charities, the main leading charities, they have information in their websites. So for instance, Rare Dementia Support is a charity led by my group here at UCL, and there is a direct support team that it is free to access for anyone, and the team can provide advice and can suggest a lot of resources and options and strategies. So that can already be very helpful. Other charities, as Alzheimer's Society, can also recommend equipment sometimes. So I guess that the charities are the main source of information at the moment.
Yes, I think I would agree with that. Of course, you can, this talk will be recorded, so you can watch it via our UEA website as well, by the YouTube channel. The other thing, just to say, if you have more specific, what we usually call more rare dementia symptoms, like posterior cortical atrophy with visual symptoms, at UEA we are one of the satellites of the Rare Dementia Network, which is led out of UCL. And so we have a group which is located here. Again, if you get in touch with us, we can connect you in that group, basically, who can support you. And there's a whole group of carers coming together who can find you or can provide you with more support and advice on those symptoms. Yes, I think, thank you. And Katie just put the email address again in the chat. So if you have any kind of want to know more about this, then please do get in touch with the and send it to the inbox. Can I just ask, so, you know, the big story at the moment is long COVID. Everybody seems to be worried about long COVID and cognitive changes or brain fog. Is there any data yet on this for dementia as far as you're aware of?
Not as far as I'm aware. You mean people with dementia?
Yes.
Who got infected and may develop long COVID?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
So I'm not aware of that data. I think it is extremely important, but I think it is also extremely difficult to investigate, because I think that the majority of people who get worse, so the worsening is usually attributed to the nature of dementia, the progressive decline. And it is a problem because they are at a disadvantage, because they are not being offered the options and the healthcare options and rehabilitation options that are offered to other people without dementia. So that this is creating more inequality. So people with dementia, in normal times, they have it more difficult than the rest of the people, because all these negative attitudes and perceptions about dementia really are barriers for people to access services and appropriate care. And I think that this is just getting worse with COVID, because the cognitive symptoms of long COVID can very easily be confused and mistaken by the natural decline of dementia. Or delirium, unresolved delirium, because some people who get infected develop delirium and then the person never come back to baseline. And many families and clinicians and practitioners may just assume that it is unresolved delirium, it is how it is. And I don't think that's the case, because we have 1 million people in the UK living with long COVID. Surely there are people with dementia who went through COVID, who got cognitive sequels after COVID, and they are really not receiving the attention that they need.
Yeah, no.
I'm not aware of data.
No, I think that's a really good point. So how about the other thing I wanted to ask about is the long-term, so people who didn't have COVID but dementia, in terms of their long-term outcome, did they have further decline after that, or after the restrictions were lifted, did they bounce back, for example, or the behavioral symptoms got better? Is there any information on that yet?
This is the £1 million question. Every time you submit a paper, the reviewers come back to you saying, oh, you cannot really be sure that this won't be reversed. And it's true, we don't have evidence. We cannot prove that this will be a permanent damage. But there is a recent paper that actually look at so I can't provide you with the name and the authors, but I can share the link later.
Don't worry, yes.
But I remember very well their results. So they were looking at changes that happened before and after the lockdown, and what happened later on. And what they saw was that actually there was a change, there was a worsening in symptoms before and during the lockdown, but once people accommodated to those changes, it seems that the worsening didn't progress. It seems that they plateaued, but they didn't find an improvement after the measures were lifted. So what it seems that happened was that, of course, isolation and lockdowns were detrimental for people with dementia, but then there was certain routine in that isolation. So people didn't continue getting worse, or at an accelerated rate, as it happened when the lockdowns were imposed. And we could assume that when all those measures are, the restrictions are lifted, people should come back to baseline, but we are not seeing that people are coming back to baseline. But on the other hand, it's the progressive nature of the disease, right? You will never expect people with dementia to become better.
Yeah.
So that is a question mark that will stay. I don't think we'll be able to respond this question. It's a very tricky one with the data we have, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you so much. Now, do we have any other further questions for Aida? And please, again, use the chat or come online. Just give you a minute and maybe to raise your hand or to come online if you want to. If not, I think I just can highlight that we have our next meeting is at the end of June, very likely the 30th of June. And we will have another speaker. Oh, I just see actually there's Sam, who has another follow-up point. Most local authorities have a sensory team who may be able to provide advice on sight loss aids or strategies as well. It's important to remember too that other eye conditions can come into play, especially as we get older, so this can exacerbate the dementia visual impairment. Thank you, Aida, and the Dementia Forum team. It's been really informative and useful as always. Thank you, Sam. That's a really good point. Yes, and of course, people need to be checked. Very often, people, of course, posterior cortical atrophy, they go first to the optometrist and get checked through, and nothing is found to be wrong with the eyes because the problem is in the brain, not in the eyes. But it's a very fair point that eyesight needs to be regularly checked so that it's not contributing as well to that. So yes, so the next meeting, as I said, is 30th of June. We have Emma Flanagan, who's a PhD student, just finished her study, and she's going to talk about supplements. So supplements, they've been always praised to raise, whether they can improve cognition or not. And Emma basically just finished a study, which is a trial looking actually at this, whether cranberry supplements in particular can improve cognition. So we'll circulate the information, but that will be likely on the 30th of June. But for now, just thank you again, Aida, for doing this talk. It was really, really great. And thank you for taking the time. And thank you to all. And yeah, you're free to go. And don't forget to email us if you have any questions or check or review the talk again on YouTube.